different things, you know? Okay. All right, as people are coming in, hello everyone who's joining us. We'll just let everybody get in and then we'll get started. All right, okay, so hello everyone, whether you're watching on Zoom or you're joining us on Facebook Live, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sophie Don. I'm the Administrative and Operations Manager for the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation in Philly. So welcome to those from Philly and from wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for this program, Teaching with Testimony with Dr. Omer Bartov. This event is part of our week-long series called Learning Through Testimony, which is our 7th Holocaust Education Week that we've done in collaboration with partners at the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee and the Wassmuth Center for Human Rights in Boise. Tomorrow, we're going to be having an event with the USC Shoah Foundation about testimony and technology. And then Friday, the Wassmuth Center will be leading an event discussing the transfer of trauma in a discussion with author Elizabeth Rosner. We'll drop information about those two events in the chat later on. But to get us started, I wanted to tell everyone a little bit about our speakers. We're so excited to have Dr. Omer Bartov with us to discuss his research and teaching, both of which rely very heavily on the use of first-person accounts as important evidence in the historic record. Dr. Bartov is a specialist on the Holocaust and comparative genocide and is a professor of European history, and German studies at Brown University. Dr. Bartov has become an influential advocate for the integration of first-person perspective in the historic record. And in this talk, he'll be discussing how in times of crisis and conflict, we often learn very rigid narratives of what happened in different historic moments, which can be very polarized between different sides and different perspectives. But bringing in personal accounts, bringing in testimony can really foster complexity and nuance and empathy in our understanding of historical events, including atrocity and genocide. The conversation with Professor Bartov is going to be led by our intern, Geraldine Francisco, who is a month away from graduating with her master's degree from Brown University in the Public Humanities. She's been with us for the whole semester, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her. Geraldine recently completed Professor Bartov's course this past semester that was entitled First-Person History in Times of Crisis, Witnessing, Memory, and Fiction. Geraldine completed her undergraduate degree at Dickinson College before completing a Fulbright in Madrid, Spain. And her research has focused on war, memory, and commemoration in Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula, where she's been exploring the best methods for historical discourse in pursuit of acknowledgement and reconciliation of difficult and contested histories. So we are so lucky to have her this semester, and we're really excited for this talk. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please drop them in the chat to me. I'm Sophie, and I will pass them along to Geraldine, and we'll hope to get those answered at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Geraldine and Professor Bartov.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Sophie. Wow. So I just want to extend my thanks and welcome to everyone for joining us this evening. Special thanks and welcome to Professor Bartov. I absolutely adored being in his class that semester, so I'm very thrilled that he has been able to join us this evening and that you all get to hear him speak. So with that being said, I guess we'll go ahead and take it away with our discussion. So being that this week is all about testimonies and learning about history using testimony, we believe that it's best to begin our conversation today with Professor Bartov by defining the term testimony. So Professor Bartov, how do you define testimony?
So hi, Geraldine, and hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm glad to talk about this topic. Testimony can be defined in different ways. I offered a particular very sort of liberal, open-ended definition of testimony. And that's the one that I used in the class that I taught in the seminar that you participated in, Geraldine, and also that I used in my writing and in a sort of article that I wrote about it some years ago. And what I mean by testimony is any kind of personal account that was given by people who participated in an event or who witnessed an event. And in the case that we were speaking about, these are extreme events or events of extreme violence. Specifically, I was writing about the Holocaust. So these can range from the most immediate, which would be diaries that people wrote or letters that people wrote in real time. They can be testimonies or accounts that they gave later on, but very close to the event. So let's say in the case of the Holocaust, people were giving accounts of what occurred even before the war ended in areas that were liberated. So from 1944, we already have accounts. Then they can be testimonies that they gave much later on. There were people who gave testimonies in the 1980s, 1990s, into the 2000s. They can also be accounts, eyewitness testimonies that were given in trials, so in a judicial setting. And then there are more distant types of accounts, which would be memoirs that people wrote, and at times also quasi-fictionalized accounts. That is, that people wrote an account which had to do with their own experience, but then recreated it also as a fictional account. All of those count in that sense. When you speak about it more specifically, in a narrower sense, then testimonies are those accounts that were given to someone who was collecting those accounts, whether they were writing it down or whether it was audio recorded or whether it was on video. And of those, there are, I would say, an estimated 60, 70,000 of the Holocaust that I know of.
All right, thank you. So you have done some significant research using testimony, particularly on the events in the East Galician town of Buchach during World War II. So can you tell us a bit more about this research, and more specifically, how do you come to focus on this place and these events, and why do you advocate using firsthand testimonies as part of the historical narrative when it comes to the events that took place in Buchach?
Yeah, so in fact, I became more and more interested in using testimonies because I wanted to research this town, what happened in that town. So I didn't start off by thinking testimonies are so important and we have to do them. Rather, I wanted to understand what happened in a particular place and time. And because of that, I realized that it was very important to use testimonies. And then I began to think about the use of testimonies more generally in writing history, and particularly history of extreme events. So the sequence was the other way around in a sense. Now, why Buchach and why this study? Originally, and I did this for a long time, so I started thinking about this in the 1990s. Originally, I was interested in understanding the nature of the encounter between the perpetrators in the Holocaust and the victims. And there was a general understanding of that at the time, largely because of the kind of history that was being written, that there was not much of such an encounter, because the killing process, as the Germans perfected it, was one that actually was meant to eschew this kind of encounter. So it was compartmentalized. No one was responsible for everything. And people were carried from one place to another. This was the understanding. Were transported, let's say, from Berlin or from France to extermination camps. And then in a sort of well-organized process, they were taken off the transports, they were undressed, they were shorn mostly of their hair, and then they were gassed in gas chambers, and then their bodies were either mass buried or incinerated. And so there was an understanding of there not really being an encounter and not being any familiarity between those who were doing the killing and those who were being killed. I was influenced in the 1990s by the fact that there were two major genocides that occurred in the 1990s, in 1992 in Bosnia and in 1994 in Rwanda. And those were very, so to speak, intimate genocides, where many of the people doing the killing knew the people they were killing. They were neighbors, they knew them by name, they had lived side by side. And I started thinking about the Holocaust in that sense, that although we knew that about half of the victims of the Holocaust were killed in extermination camps, the other half were not. And most of them were killed where they lived. And so I thought, how do we understand this better? Because the Holocaust is a huge event, right? It happened in an entire continent. About 6 million people were killed. Hundreds of thousands of people were involved in organizing this. So how can we understand it? And I thought the best way to do that would be to look at what happened in one town. And so I chose a town. But the reason I chose this town was in part because I knew something about it, because anyone in Israel, I come from Israel, and in Israel, people, at least of my generation, know a very famous author. His name is Shmuel Yosef Agnon, or Shai Agnon. He's the only Hebrew language author to have received the Nobel Prize in Literature. He came from Buchach, and he wrote a great deal about Buchach. So I read his writings already when I was in high school. So I knew something about it, but only from his fiction. But I also knew that my mother came from Buchach, and I knew nothing about her own childhood there because we never spoke about it. And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity. Maybe I'll find out also a little bit about where my mother came from. And so I interviewed her in 1995. And that really, for me, was the first person account. The first testimony was the one that I collected from my mother. And I was then already 41 years old when I did that. She was 71. And it was the first time that she spoke about growing up in that town. So in that sense, I chose this town specifically also for personal reasons. So it created a kind of intimacy between me and the history I was writing, and for a kind of methodological, historical reason, because I believe that if you can tell and understand well what happened in one place, and you can do it only through also listening to the voices of the people that were there, then you may understand much more about the event as a whole, which you cannot understand if you look at it from the top and never go to the places themselves in which it occurred.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And like in relation to testimony and clearly just your experience with this one town, with the town that your mother's from, it shows that there's just so much that we can learn from one given testimony. So with that being said, I guess our next question would be why have historians traditionally been wary of using testimonies as historical evidence? And what has been the result of omitting first-person accounts? You've already told us what's the result of bringing them into the historical narrative, but why have historians not done so in the past?
Yeah, so this is a major question, and it didn't occur to me for quite a while because I was also, part of this historiography, and there were good reasons that historians gave for why they were wary of using testimonies. And I personally, for quite a while, thought, yes, it makes sense. until I started understanding what the problems are with doing that. So the reasons that historians have given usually is that testimonies, first of all, are subjective. People say what they remember, what they saw, how they felt. They're influenced by their own emotions, their own reactions to the event. Secondly, usually testimonies are collected after the fact. And it may be a year later, it may be 10 years later, it may be 40 or 50 years later. When people feel that now they are able to talk about it, or when somebody comes and actually asks them for the first time, as I did with my mother, although she was not there during the Holocaust, but if nobody asks you, sometimes you wouldn't say. And so when people talk about something that happened to them a long time ago, and particularly an event that was very traumatic, you can expect that they will not get everything right. They may be wrong about the dates. They may be wrong about names. They may be influenced. They may become influenced over time by what they hear about the event. If it's a well-known event, such as the Holocaust, about which there were movies made and books published, and they may sort of internalize that so that by the time they talk about their own personal experience, that would be tainted, this is the argument at least, by everything that they'd heard in between. So historians said, well, we would rather use only documents that come from that place at that time, that were written at the time, and not what people say later on. So it made sense from that kind of logic. The problem was, of course, that when you write a history of a genocide, such as the Holocaust, and you base it on these kind of, so to speak, objective documents, and these are simultaneous documents that were produced at the time, contemporary documentation, since the people who are being murdered usually don't have the time or the ability to produce documents, these documents are produced by the people who are killing them. So what you are recreating using such documents is the event as it was seen by the perpetrators. This is simply the way it would happen. They're not interested in the perspective of the victims, and they're not producing documents in order to record the event as it occurred from the perspective of those they're killing. So you're writing fundamentally a skewed history. Now, there was a whole body of scholarship that was largely based on these kind of documents. I would not say that it falsified the history of the Holocaust, that it was not accurate, because historians worked really hard to try and reconstruct the event. But there were things it could not do. There were aspects of the event it could not do because of the nature of the documents they used. There is another aspect to this, and this is that many people who testified about the event, whether it was right away after the event, when they were interviewed about it, and there were collections done already, as I said, already in 1944, there was an historical commission created particularly by Polish Jews, Polish historians. As Poland was being taken over by the Red Army, liberated from German occupation, and they were collecting these documents in order to understand what happened. They were collecting them as historical documents, right? The people themselves who were giving these testimonies, whether it was as early as 1944, and whether it was later on, in many, many cases, wanted to tell their story so that it would be used by historians, so that it would become part of the historical record. But historians were not using it because they were saying, this is stories that people tell, and we don't know if they are accurate or not. So we will take documents produced by the Wehrmacht, by the Gestapo, by the SS, and we will say these are objective. But those by the people they killed are not. That created not so much a historical reconstruction of the Holocaust that was inaccurate, but one that was skewed. And so my own feeling about this was that the way you could get around the problems that we do have with testimonies, it would be, or the most effective way to get around it, would be to try and focus on one place. If you focus on one place, on a limited area, for that area, you can collect all the evidence that is available. That evidence will include all the official documentation that exists and can include all the testimonies that exist and other, testimonies in my case, when I was studying this town, were not only testimonies by Jews, there were testimonies by Poles, by Ukrainians, by Germans who were not perpetrators, but were there for other reasons. And if you use it all, use everything you have, you can then combine the different perspectives. And what you get is a three-dimensional view of what occurred. You're not looking at it only from one perspective, but from many. And they may not agree with each other. They may sometimes complement each other and sometimes contradict each other. But together they give you a much more, I'd say, nuanced picture of what happened and how different people who were there at the same time saw it. And that, if you think about it, is what we would do every day in our own lives, right? If you're at a party and then you sit with friends and each person will say, oh, I had this experience and I had that experience. And the event itself is a conglomerate of all these experiences. And if you're talking about a traumatic event, an extreme event, then those differences may be very extreme. If you're talking about how a perpetrator saw it, how a neighbor saw it, how a child saw it who was running for her life, you together are creating something that is much more, I would say, closer to the reality of the event than using only some of these testimonies or some of these documents. And that's why I made the argument that we have to use testimonies as historical documents. All historical documents have limitations, and all historical documents are valuable. And we have to use them in conjunction with everything else we can find.
Right. Yeah, agreed. And this discussion so far also brings into like this overall question of accuracy, the accuracy of testimony. And as you stated, it's a question that concerns many researchers and historians when thinking about the use of testimony. So like we were hoping to, explore this question of accuracy a little bit further. So with that being said, how has shame or guilt played into testimony collection? We talked about how you can see trauma and crisis affect one's ability to accurately recollect. But one thing that we don't think about too much is if perpetrators or bystanders are giving their testimonies, is there a fear of them trying to absolve themselves through their testimony?
Yes, of course. So let me say two things here. First, I just want to make a point because I think it's very important to stress that that when you do this kind of work, when you do this kind of local history, where you try to do, as I did, a kind of total history, that is to use all the documents available, then you learn things, and that is not only from testimonies, but also from testimonies that you would otherwise not know. And they're not minor things, they're actually major things. And they have to do, in the case of the Holocaust, with some of the main, I'd say, conventions of how we think, or how we used to think, about the Holocaust. And I would say that that applies to many other cases of genocide. And I'll just name three. One is secrecy. In the whole discussion of the Holocaust, there was a question of who knew what was happening. How did the information come out? Did the Germans know about what their own people, what the security police agencies were doing when Jews were taken away from neighborhoods and shipped off to the east, that people know what was happening to them? In a case like this, you know that there was no secrecy whatsoever, because everything was very public. The killing was public. It happened on the street. It happened on nearby hills within a 10-minute walking distance. So this whole structure that we've created of, do we know, there were books written about it, what did the Germans know, and so forth, the people who were there. And it's not in that town alone, of course. We are talking about 50% of the people who were murdered in the Holocaust were murdered where they lived. And so this notion of secrecy really does not apply at all. The second is anonymity. The idea, as I said, was that because the Germans needed to perfect this, or wanted to perfect the system of distancing between the killers and the victims, they created this whole extermination camp system. But in about half of the cases, none of that happened. Not only were they public, these killings, and not secret, the people doing the killing very often knew the people they were killing. It was much more like what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda than our image of the Holocaust as a kind of mechanical, industrial killing. And the last very important element is the question of bystanders, because we've spoken, you know, for several decades now, there's a sort of tendency to talk about the three categories of genocide, and especially of the Holocaust, of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. And most people are bystanders. Most people don't do the killing, and most people don't do the dying. And so there was a question about what is the position of the bystanders in such a case. But if you look on the local level, this whole phenomenon of bystanders tends to vanish. Nobody really is a bystander. Nobody stands by. Everybody is involved in one way or another, because everybody knows everybody else, because these places are small, because there are issues of property, of relationship between people. And so there are issues of rescue or denunciation, which are a sort of major element of how these events unfold. And therefore, there are only degrees of engagement, from complete collaboration with the killers to total altruism and rescue. And most people are someplace in the middle. So that's just 3 points that I wanted to talk about. Now, if we then go into these questions that you raised of shame and guilt and trauma, this too, you know, when you study one place, you get to know the people that you're studying, right? You sort of, especially if you did it as I did for a long time, you yourself develop an intimate relationship with them. It doesn't mean that you necessarily like them, but you get to know them. And so the thing that is most striking about such events, and in some ways it shouldn't be surprising, but it's shocking, is that survivors of genocide, and survivors specifically, those survivors that I know of who survived, the very few who survived the genocide in Bucha. There were about 10,000 people killed there. There were less than 100 who survived of the population. A population that was 8,000, although they killed more than they lived there because they brought people from the outside. Those who survived were often wrecked by a sense of guilt. They felt guilty. They felt guilty because everyone else died. They felt guilty because it was their siblings, it was their parents, it was their children. Why did they survive and everyone else died? They felt guilty because there were things they had to do in order to survive. And so they were, for the rest of their lives, they had a sense of guilt. The perpetrators, and I did a lot of work on those people too, never showed any sign of guilt, never indicated in any way that I could find, even decades later, not guilt, not remorse, not any sense of pity whatsoever. It's quite extraordinary to see that. Now, including people who were not doing the killing, but were just watching, or kind of administrators who were there, housewives who were there, children who were there, because the perpetrators were very comfortable there. There were not many of them. They brought their wives, they brought their children, they brought their parents. It was a nice place. It was safe. No one was shooting at them. They were doing the shooting. There was a lot of food. There was a lot of booze to have. They had a good time. They, even decades later, felt no guilt whatsoever. So this as such is kind of shocking, because when they recollect what happened, when they were interviewed about that, say 20 years later, they record that event, or the presence there, as a really good time. They record it as a time that they enjoyed. And when you think about these two completely different perspectives on an event that we, looking at it from the outside, think it's absolutely horrifying, it tells you something about, I think, the need to look at such events from close up, however difficult it is. And that gets me to the sort of trauma. So clearly we cannot believe anyone just on the face of it. If you ask someone what happened and they tell you, and you're an historian, you have to check whether it's correct or not. They may not remember, or they may not want to tell you the truth, right? And certainly in accounts given by perpetrators, which they did in judicial settings, you can tell that they're not telling the truth. And obviously the judges involved in that, the interrogators, the police, they all try to get at the truth. But we have very few testimonies by these people. They were not tempted to write down what happened, because what happened would incriminate them. And so you have a sense that what they tell you is not the truth, but there is a truth in it. And the truth is sometimes between the lines. They won't necessarily tell you, although some do, about the process of the killing, but they can tell you about the good time they had. And then you can find other things out from other witnesses. And so you get a sense of this sort of social environment that existed there, that you would not get from official documents that are not interested in that. When you talk about trauma, for the witnesses and for the researcher, for the scholar trying to figure all this out, although to a much lesser degree, of course, that is a major problem. You know, one of the people who came from Buchach was Simon Wiesenthal, who was known after the war as the Nazi hunter. He had an office in Vienna, and he was involved in trying to locate former Nazi perpetrators for years and years and years. He also tried to locate the people who did the killings in Buchach itself, where his family was and where his family was murdered. it was not easy to get people who survived to agree to come to German law courts in the 1950s and 60s and to testify. Because in order to testify, first of all, you had to recollect all of that. Mm. And that is horrendously traumatic. It's reliving the entire thing. And then you're standing in front of a German judge. The people that you were terrified of at the time are right there in the courtroom, and your evidence is being doubted. You're being asked, are you sure that it happened on that day at that hour? We have other indications that it didn't. And so not only are you traumatized by recollecting the event, your recollection is then undermined by the judicial process. And now when you, as a scholar, are reading these events, and I did that for a long time, it's sometimes very, very hard to read these accounts because they are literally unimaginable. And yet you know that they happened. And they happened not once or twice, they happen en masse. So shame and guilt and trauma play a huge role, but they don't always play the role that you expect they would. And you have to be very sensitive to that when you're using this kind of material.
Right. And now you also raise like a very important point when you talked about the 3 categories. And that also raises, the importance of, looking at these histories, not just like within one small town, but like with each individual, and, not expecting anything based on their so-called category. So with that being said, we want to reference one of your many papers, which we highly recommend for the audience. And that paper being Wartime Lies and Other Testimonies. In this paper, you write, testimonies repeatedly illustrate that even in the midst of the horror, there was always a measure of choice. So what does testimony tell us about choice and agency based on your research and what you found?
One thing that really struck me reading hundreds of personal accounts was that at any given moment, people made choices. Mm-hmm. And we tend to think of genocide partly because those who perpetrate genocide want us to think that way, that people were left with no choice. People did what they did because there was nothing else they could do, whether they were the murderers who were, so to speak, following orders, and whether it was the bystanders who really couldn't do anything, or whether it was the victims who, so to speak, went like sheep to the slaughter, because there was nothing else to be done. And you actually realize that at any moment, people made choices all the time. They may have been very small choices. They were within very specific constraints, but such choices made a difference. Mm-hmm. They could have made a difference simply because you were looking for shelter and you knocked on someone's door and they gave you a glass of milk or a piece of bread. They could have made a difference because someone actually showed you some warmth. Mm-hmm. They could have made a difference, and that was quite striking in some accounts, because for someone, let's say a Gestapo officer was walking down the street during a roundup and saw a woman and a child and was about to take them to the site where they would be shot. And the woman, and I'm talking about a specific case, and the woman was well dressed and spoke very good German and said to him, "I lost my other daughter, I can't find her. I know you will kill us, but can you not do it today? Can you this time let me go, because I want to find my daughter?" And this Gestapo officer was a young man who sees a young, elegant woman and she's speaking good German. has a moment and he wants to be gallant. And he says, okay, I'll let you go now. He feels good about himself for a moment because he's done something gallant. She and the two children are saved. Now, he may not remember that, of course, because his hands are full of blood. He's killed and killed and killed. But he saved her at that moment. And she, or rather in this case, one of the children, tells that story 40 years later. And so there was a choice that was being made, and that choice made a difference. And it is part of that story. So in that sense, I think that for one thing, when you talk about choice, you are depriving genocide of one of its most powerful arguments, that you cannot stand against it, that you have no choice, that it's so total and so relentless. And you say, no, people all the time made choices, and those choices made a difference. The same is, I'd say, more generally, the other major argument of genocide, and in the Holocaust it's particularly the case, is that the génocidaires, the people, the perpetrators, don't only want to kill a certain group of people. They also want to eliminate their memory. They want to actually erase the killing which erased the people. They want it to never be remembered. And that's one reason that using only their own documents is so, I'd say, morally dubious. When you tell the story of the people, which is why those people told the stories, you are rescuing their memory, not even if they were killed, you at least bring them back. You're not telling the story of the Holocaust, as was often told by historians, only as a bureaucratic machine, a bureaucratic undertaking, whose ultimate result, is millions of corpses. You're telling the story of the people. You are giving them back their identity, their memory, and their individual story. And we are all, as individuals, each of us has a story to tell. We're not just numbers. And so in that sense, I think it's, to my mind at least, there is a kind of ethical necessity to do that, particularly when you're rewriting or reconstructing the story of a genocide.
Yeah, definitely. And I had the immense pleasure of taking your graduate seminar last semester.
It was great having you there, by the way.
Thank you. There are so many amazing students in this class as well. It was amazing, on top of the material and the readings, and just all the knowledge that you gave us to work with as well. So with that being said, the class was amazing, and we were wondering if you can explain your idea for this course and how you came about creating this course. Precisely, how do you determine which historical events to focus on, and what kinds of testimonies or first-person histories to include in the seminar?
So let me start by saying, first of all, that I love teaching the seminar, and the reason I love teaching the seminar is that, as happened last time when you were there, first of all, that I'm lucky to always have really fantastic students. And the Talmud says someplace that you have learned from all your students, and I really feel that when you have a bunch of smart, truly invested, interesting, creative young people in a seminar, it makes a whole difference. But beyond that, because I constructed the seminar, as you remember, in a way that it was not just the materials that I let you read, that I asked you to read, but I asked each student to present something that they were interested in, that they were researching, but to do it from the point of view of the seminar, that is, from the perspective of first-person history. And so I was learning simply also by reading what you assigned and by listening to your papers. And I think that the best kind of teaching, or the best kind of a teacher environment, is where everyone is learning. If the professor is not learning, then something is not going right. And I would say that about any teaching environment. You, as a teacher, have to be open to learn from your students, whether they're 4-year-olds or 20-year-olds or 40-year-olds. If you don't learn, then you don't develop. So that's as a sort of general pedagogical idea that I have, and it developed in large part also because of this seminar. Now, why did I decide to teach the seminar? It had to do with the years that I did of researching this book, Anatomy of a Genocide, and my own growing interest in telling history as a first-person history. That is history with a lowercase h, not the history from the top, not the history of the big historians, but the history as it is perceived and as it is told by the people who are, so to speak, subjected to it. Because people also make history. History is, in a sense, the sum of what we all do, right? This is what it is. It's not only what our leaders do. It's not only what generals do. It's also what the people do. In time, as I became more absorbed also in thinking about it, I started thinking also about first-person history, not in the sense that the book I wrote, as I explained before, had to do with first-person history. That is, using people's accounts to reconstruct an event together with other documents, but rather of telling a first-person history. That is, a history in which the person writing it is also engaged. And that's a somewhat different idea. It's related, but it's not the same. And that's what I'm now actually engaged in doing. I haven't started writing it yet. I'm sort of reading around it. And I'm telling you this because it has to do with the choices I made in the readings. So the course is about first-person history in times of crisis. The crisis I originally chose for the course was the Holocaust, both because of its importance as an event in the 20th century, and I'm a modern European historian, also because there is a mass of evidence about it. It's one of the best recorded genocides and historical events by now. It wasn't that right after the war, but from the 80s and 90s, it became that. Because it's what I have been studying for a long time, and so I know a fair amount about it. So it had to do with that I chose this. But as I began thinking about the next project I want to do, I started, as you saw, introducing other readings which had to do with another event. And that event has to do with the history of Israel-Palestine. Now, I come from Israel. I was born in Israel in the 1950s, and I'm interested in writing a history of my generation, which is the generation that was born after, as I say, everything happened. We were born right after World War II, right after the Holocaust, and the Holocaust was very present in my childhood because I was surrounded by people who were survivors of the Holocaust, but I was born after, and I was born as an Israeli with a sort of view forward. Zionism was all about creating something new and not looking back. And I was also born in a country in which there had been a war in 1948. And in that war, the majority of the Palestinian population of that area that had lived there was either expelled or fled. And therefore, it was a curious moment to be born in, and one in which my generation was really taught not to think about. We were not supposed to think about what happened before us, not about where our parents came from, and not about what we were born into or what had been there just before we were born. Although we were surrounded not only by Holocaust survivors, but a great deal of abandoned property, as it was called, that is, empty Arabic villages. And so to tell that story as a first-person story interested me a great deal. How members of my generation, including myself, came into a kind of self-understanding from these two major hiatuses of our childhood. Now that meant that I wanted to introduce more and more of that kind of storytelling into the course of first-person history in time of crisis, because I'd say at the core of this is the encounter between two moments of crisis, two traumas. One is the trauma of the Holocaust, and in the case, if I look at it from my perspective, my personal perspective, it's the people who had come from there. And the other is the trauma of an entire group of people, an entire people that loses its country in a very violent war. And so I wanted to put them next to each other, not only because they're two traumatic events, but that they're two traumatic events that touch on each other. And I think that in what we were talking about in class, and it's happened to me before, the papers that were presented by students also were on this sort of overlap of different traumas. Mm-hmm. And I think when you do it that way, then you think about each event in relationship to another. And for me, understanding usually comes not only from thinking, as I said before, sort of focusing on a certain point, on looking at things from below, but also, and that's my other sort of interest of comparative genocide, also in looking at two things side by side, trying to understand one thing from another. And so that was the sort of choice that I have increasingly made in teaching this class. Now, just in terms of the readings themselves, then sort of the way I went about constructing the course is actually exactly as I said about the nature of testimonies, going from the most immediate to the most distant, from what people write at the time in diaries, in letters, in accounts that they're writing at the time, to fiction, and even to cases of false memories, of false fiction, of false memoirs, of people saying that they had experienced what they had not experienced, and why do they make these choices? So in the seminar, I wanted to go from the closest to the farthest, because I think that each of those sheds light on all the others. And at the end, you get a much more comprehensive understanding of what it is when we talk about first-person history, what we're actually talking about.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Professor Bartov. We have so many other questions, but for the sake of time, unfortunately, we might have to cut it here. Is that correct, Sophie?
I think if you want to ask our last question.
Yeah, because I think it's definitely important. So in relation to this seminar, we mentioned that it drew students from diverse subfields in history, as well as from other disciplines, for example, me. And you already explained one of our core assignments being in which you asked us to each supply a class reading list, make presentations, and write papers in an area of our own special interests. So I personally thought that was an excellent way for us to draw comparisons, to explore other historical narratives, but most importantly, to create empathy towards others and other histories and stories of crisis. So as an educator teaching about testimony and focusing on the Holocaust, but discussing many other historical atrocities and genocides, how do you make sure each subject is given its appropriate respect?
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is especially when you study the Holocaust. I mean, this question comes up a lot, and so I've been around for a while, and so I've seen different phases of that. You know, when I went to do a DPhil at Oxford, so I came there in 1980. In 1980, when you came to read history, as they call it, at Oxford, you couldn't study the Holocaust. It was not on the curriculum. You might go to, they had a Jewish study center that was affiliated with Oxford, but was not part of the curriculum, was sort of, but you couldn't study it at all. So it was still, the case of the Holocaust was highly marginalized at the time. Now we know that the Holocaust now features as a major event in history and in the 20th century and World War II and all of that, but that has happened in the last 30 years. Much more recently, there have been arguments, often by scholars of genocide, of comparative genocide, that there is a sort of tendency to use the Holocaust as a measuring rod. You say, well, this was a genocide. Was it as bad as the Holocaust? It wasn't so bad. It was not such a terrible. That kind of thinking means that now the Holocaust has become an event that you say, well, this was the absolute worst. And then you have, obviously, that's a totally wrong way of going about things. This is like trying to compare suffering. You say, you know, children who starved in the Ukrainian famine, did they suffer more or less than children who suffered in ghettos? It makes no sense to ask these questions. You can try to understand the historical context of both events, but there are elements in them that you cannot compare. And yet, at the same time, if you want to understand one event, you have to compare it with another. And there has been an argument, it hasn't entirely disappeared, it's particularly common in my own homeland, in Israel, that the Holocaust is unique. And when you say about an historical event that it's unique, it means that you can't compare it to anything else. It's of a category of its own. It's sui generis. I believe that if you say that about an historical event, you're taking it out of history, you're extracting it from history, and you're putting it in some other sphere, in a metaphysical sphere. It may be theologically important, philosophically important, but it's incomparable. Once you do that, you lose any understanding of it. Historically, it stops being something that you can understand. I believe that any event that happens in history, including absolutely the Holocaust, can only be understood in relationship to another. Not so as to say one is worse than the other, but in order to understand one from understanding the other. And in our course, I think, people spoke in large part about other traumatic events. We were not comparing them in the sense of saying which was worse, which is a completely useless and, to my mind, stupid kind of comparison. We were trying to understand one from the other. So if we had a paper about the internment of the Japanese, right, or if we had whatever we spoke about, or your work, we can learn from how people, for instance, recall traumatic events. What work has been done on trying to recreate them, on trying to get people to speak about them, about commemorating them. We can learn from one event about another, understanding it, and also how you deal with it, how you deal with trauma, how you deal with testimony, how it passes, how memory passes through generations, how trauma affects second, third generation. That you can understand when you speak about such events in a relationship to each other. And that, I think, is extremely, to me, has been very important. I taught for quite a few years, and I start teaching next year again, History of Genocide in the 20th century. And I had to do a lot of reading for that. And my understanding of the areas that I specialize in greatly improved, I think, by studying other cases, because you then see them from different perspectives.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was the perfect way to wrap it up. And I wish that we can keep you longer for like 3 hours, just like our class was last semester. But for now, I'll just pass it along to Sophie, so she can make a few announcements. But before that, thank you again so much, Professor Bartov. It's always great hearing from you and hearing you speak. There's always, even though I've heard some of the things in today's talk in our class, I still learned something new this evening from you. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Odin, and thank you to everybody I cannot see, but for attending this.
Well, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Cheryl Dean. This was such an amazing conversation, and we're so grateful to have both of your expertise in this discussion. I think it really adds to like the complexity of thinking about the importance and like the usefulness of testimony in academia, but also thinking about storytelling more broadly. And I think this perfectly sets us up for our next events as well. Thank you so much, Professor. Our event tomorrow with USC Shoah, thinking about using testimony in the future. So how is technology playing a role in our use of testimony and recording testimony? And then on Friday, thinking about generational inherited trauma. So I'm gonna drop a link in the chat to our calendar for the other 2 events, and you can register there if you'd like to join us for those. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you on tomorrow and on Friday. And we hope you have a great evening. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Night.